Welcome to today's episode of DTCC Insight Podcast, where I'm joined by Ollie Williams, where we'll be diving into the evolving world of OTC derivatives transaction reporting. Thank you for being here today, Ollie.
It's my pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the big picture. Regulatory regimes have been revising trade reporting requirements and adopting common data standards. How have these changes impacted the complexity and cost of transaction reporting for firms operating across multiple jurisdictions?
It's a great question, and I think there's many parts to the answer, but I think we should start with the simple fact that any change is going to require effort by a firm, right? So the first thing we should talk about is that evolving or ongoing change means that firms need to themselves evolve and rebuild and rethink their processes and platforms. So that's going to come with a cost, both in terms of financial, but also in terms of people, resources, and so on. So that's the first thing. But I think if we look at what has happened in the last couple of years, there's some other more nuanced answers to your question. Firstly, depending on who you are. So the different roles and responsibilities have evolved somewhat, and I think we'll talk about that a little later as we move on. But if I think about some of the firms who we're dealing with today, some of the bigger changes that have impacted them sound relatively simple. So we hear a lot about new data standards, and that has a number of different forms. But if we look at the most obvious one, firms have been asked to use a new XML standard. Sounds relatively simple. XML is something we're all familiar with, but in practice, repositioning your entire platform onto a new data standard is a significant lift and a significant challenge. When we look at what is being asked of firms in terms of what they're reporting, similarly, I think we see some great examples where on the surface the change is relatively benign, but in practice making it work is quite complicated and difficult, particularly when you're looking at cross-jurisdictional obligation. And I'll give you a good example of that, and I think it's probably the easiest example, and that is UPI, the Unique Product Identifier. Having a concept such as UPI makes a lot of sense. You can identify a product in a very distinct and simple way. But implementing processes whereby a reporting entity can get the information they require in time and get it correctly so that they have that information is quite complicated. We do see some divergence cross-border with requirements like that. So our clients that have a global obligation have had particular challenges with things like UPI. We have others as well, many like that. So I think the simple answer to your question is change, cost of change, obviously, but some new complexity introduced with what broadly is called a simplification is how I'd answer your question.
Very interesting. I think that it's interesting because we've now got a period of relative relaxation around regulatory change. And so it gives firms the opportunity to address some of these more strategic changes that they need to make.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think in that relative calm, if you want to call it that, we see another challenge which has come out of these changes, which is scrutiny. Right? So I think as the community comes out of a period of change, sitting back and being able to have a look at what you've got and what you've done is happening not just with the reporting entities, but obviously it's happening with the regulators too. So one of the other things that we've seen is, I think, a sharp increase in challenges firms are facing in answering questions around the quality of their own reporting. And that comes to your point, right? Looking at processes, looking at what they've put in place, and looking at the way they are operating their reporting broadly. For any firm, that's a challenge. But if you look at a firm that has a global obligation, there's an added layer of technical challenge and also resourcing challenge to that.
Absolutely. I think we've seen a transition around timeliness of reporting data now to data quality, and this is going to be a big challenge for firms going forward.
Exactly right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think in the early days, and we're not doing that long ago, really, you're right about just the focus being on what is reported, have I reported it, done. But now there's a lot more focus on, what is the detail that I've reported? Does it match my counterparty? Does it meet the regulatory standard? And having the ability to understand that. And I think we'll talk about that as we move on. Yeah. But I think that's a key part of the challenge for the reporting community.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to talk more specifically about data quality and the challenges, because they seem to be a central theme within reg reporting. What are the key challenges firms face when trying to deliver high quality, actionable data to regulators?
Sure. So I think this is probably the best place to go back to my earlier comment about it kind of depends on who you are and what your obligation is, and to an extent where you are in the world. But if we look at what we're doing with our clients, I think particularly in your business on the consulting side, one of the areas I think it's important to call out with this period of change that we've gone through is the buy side. or those firms that rely on other people to do the reporting for them. And this broadly comes to the topic of transparency. How can you get a good view of what is being done on your behalf, and how can you measure that? How can you actually understand that it's being done correctly, timely, and so on? Ultimately, one of the things we've seen, particularly in Asia, I would say, is a clarification on the obligation holder. And with that clarification has come a higher standard of expectation. So part of my answer is ability to access information and to understand that information to monitor what is being done for you. But I think we can flip that to a firm that's reporting for themselves as well. It's not a dissimilar problem. In the short term, I guess they have an easier access to their data, but being able to understand, is this data actually correct? Am I reporting it correctly? Does it meet what my peers are doing? Does it meet what the regulator's expecting? And can I get it quickly enough and do something with it to answer those questions? These are the big challenges we're seeing firms
It's very interesting that you're mentioning comparison against peers in regards to data quality. So benchmarking is incredibly valuable for firms. Where can they go to get that insight?
Great question, and this really is something I think we've played a bit of a role in. So after the rewrites, or certainly when they were first being dreamt up, one of the problem statements that we've been working with our user group on is, how do we do benchmarking? We're fairly well placed to do that as a trade repository because we have a lot of the information. The benchmarking question is one that's, I think, solved through a combination of having the right data in the right place, but also being in a community that is large enough to make a meaningful comparison. One of the things I think that we have identified through conversations with clients, whether it be through consulting or with our trade repository hat on, and also through conversations with the broader industry, is that it's not just the reporting side that's looking at benchmarking. It's fairly obvious that as technology evolves and tooling evolves, our regulators are as well. So how can we help industry, and where can they go to answer that question of where do I look, or where do I compare to my peers? Is a key challenge, and I think we're working on that right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I see a lot of our clients talk about resource constraints and a shortage of skilled reporting SMEs. Is that something that you've seen, especially in APAC?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it probably is more of an APAC problem than it might be in Europe or North America. And that is where I think we've been doing a lot of great work through our consulting practice, helping firms, I guess, climb that hill using resources that actually understand what the requirements are, but probably more importantly, understand how others are doing things. These are not easy resources to find. And if you speak to a COO or someone with a checkbook, the challenge with this is you can't bring on unlimited resources. How do you strategically find the resources you need to put in place something that's sustainable for the longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So moving on to systemic risk and data harmonisation. So obviously that's one of the primary goals for regulators is mitigating that global systemic risk. So why is harmonising data standards so critical to achieving this goal, and what are the risks in the short term?
Sure. So yeah, let's go back. I mean, I think the initial aim of the rewrite process was to give regulators a better global data set. And I think that kind of answers the question. It's a global problem statement. So the markets we operate in now are not independent regional markets. They're very interconnected. And I think that the original sort of G20 proclamation around this was looking at exactly that. How can a regulator see exposure across an entity? And that exposure might be jurisdiction specific, but it's likely to be in multiple jurisdictions. So I think the first point is having a standardised set of requirements across the globe is kind of a no-brainer in terms of how do you achieve the ability to harmonise at a risk level and a risk monitoring level. When you're asking about the sort of what the challenges are, I think the challenges come down to divergence. And I think firms or reporting entities have gone on a great journey to get to where we are today. A lot of money spent, a lot of effort put into this. Where there are still divergences, we see the creation of some challenges with harmonisation. And I think that it's reasonable to say, and we're seeing some of this in Europe today, that regulators are looking at this, and there will be opportunities for change, I suspect, that will fix some of those fringe problems
And with that, whilst it's strategically important to harmonise data, I suppose a lot of clients that I've heard are talking about the increased costs associated with doing that journey. So there will be short-term pain for long-term benefits. Is that something that you've seen?
Definitely. And then flipping the question a little bit, we see some clients asking, I have to go through this process. Is there a way I can do it where there are other benefits from doing it? And this comes to the question which we probably get onto a little. How does all of this fit into bigger data questions that firms are facing? So how does your data model help your reporting, right? Is your data model reporting specific? Probably not the best place for it to be, but it's quite a common place. Or is your reporting data coming from a holistic data set that's used across the firm? So I think to get to your question, it is work, and work is required. The more interesting question is how can you do that in a way that contributes to a broader program of work that you might be embarking on.
Absolutely.
With your data models.
100%. I think a lot of the clients that we've spoken about, the evolution of reg reporting have had to look upstream to data, and so we see a lot of responsibilities in the roles that individuals take within a bank, for instance, being that convergence between reg reporting and data. And often a lot of the discussions we're having around who owns the data, who is the fundamental owner for that data. So it makes it a lot easier when a reg change comes in to find the root cause of what the change is going to be and who's going to own that and who's going to be responsible for that data going forward.
I couldn't agree more, and I think this is an interesting point you make. That in the perfect world, yes, change can lead to that ability to set up a data model, if you like, including roles and responsibilities and stewardship that allows for that easy identification, rectification, remediation, but also potentially value add. The reality, going back to the very first question you asked, what have been the sort of challenges with this? The reality for firms is that vision is accepted broadly, but achieving it is difficult, particularly when you're facing a large pace of change. And you asked at the beginning, what does this mean for those that have a global obligation? They've faced many years now of continual change. It's a real challenge to step back and say, are we doing this the right way? And actually have the resources to make the changes necessary. So I think one of the things that is really interesting from your business, Rebecca, is that we can work with firms to identify incremental ways they can get towards that end state as we address more change, as we do remediation, and as firms look at their own, I guess, models.
Absolutely. I think this is a theme that we're seeing across post-trade, right, where there is a discussion amongst clients as to whether they resolve for the tactical. Do they just do enough to get them to comply with the regulators, or do they look at more strategic change, which is kind of what you're saying? Exactly. So moving on to best practices. So regulators consistently emphasise transparency, oversight and benchmarking. What best practices would you recommend for firms aiming to strengthen these areas in their reporting processes? Good question, and I think it again depends on who you are. I've said that a few times today, but it really does. And that first piece is really identifying who you are. Where do you sit in the industry? What are you? Are you a large derivative house, or are you a shop that's using derivatives to hedge your businesses? So you're going to have a different standard of what best practice is, and even understanding where you are and what your peers do is really important to that question. You don't want to build a race car if you just walk into the shops. But equally, if you're on the racetrack, you kind of need to have something that performs. So we spend a lot of time with firms identifying just that question, right? What are others doing? What is a reasonable approach? So understanding that is key. But having, whatever your approach ends up being and whatever your risk appetite is, having the right governance in place over your program, having the right frameworks in place that give relevant people clear roles and responsibilities within the reporting obligation and life cycle, and having access to the data to measure yourself are fundamentals. We think the other emerging trend is access to SMEs or access to expertise. And that's kind of a communal thing to an extent. And I think that's where we can play a role as well. What is the best way to tackle this? How can we all tackle this together? And how can a firm put in place a reasonable approach to ongoing monitoring? So for example, if we go in and help a firm today, or anyone goes in and helps a firm today, and they put in place a program,
how do you make sure that next year or the year after, you're on track with that program? Those sort of things are critical to address in terms of getting yourself in the right place.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the work that we do from a consulting perspective is around control frameworks, and we do a lot of health checks, and we see that year on year that firms are keen to continuously monitor and make sure that they are doing, they're applying the best practices and things like that. The other thing that we've spoken about before a little bit is the transparency of having the data. And I know that the tools that we've got, such as trade reporting analytics, really help clients to identify issues and then allow themselves to benchmark themselves against others and improve their quality of data and timeliness and all sorts of things.
Absolutely right, and it's an evolving process, and it's kind of circular as well. Work that is done to identify problems can be fed back into the tooling that helps identify problems. TRA, or Trade Reporting Analytics, is a really good example of a couple of things we've touched on. So community is one piece, right? So when answering the question, how do you prepare, how do you benchmark, how do you make sure you're in the right place, community is key. I think that's been pretty obvious in the derivative space for some time. But tooling that is community built, or at least is a community owned tooling in terms of contributing insights and information as to what you should be looking at, is really important. TRA has been interesting for us because we're seeing that happen naturally. We're seeing our clients share ideas and share, I guess, insights that they want to be measuring, that they can all measure. Very useful.
Absolutely. I've seen clients really quite enjoy competing with themselves, that they see when they first receive TRA and they look at their benchmarking, and then they liked to see improvements, and they're able to see that. So that's been a bit of a game changer for them, I think. Okay. Fantastic. So moving on to resources and expertise. Maintaining compliance and managing remediation efforts require specialised skills, and we've talked about this a little bit, but how can organisations ensure they have the right resources and expertise to keep pace with evolving regulatory demands? It's
a challenge, and I think to your earlier point about where you are in the world, it can be a differing challenge depending on where you're located. So I think there's a couple of things to that. So firstly, it comes back to our earlier point around community and being part of a collective, so to understand what is coming and how it needs to be dealt with. Subject matter expertise is a tough one because, as we said earlier, no firm is in a position to hire everyone they need for a moment of change. So working out how you combine emerging technology, right, emerging capabilities that are coming at fast pace, let's be honest, that are revolutionising the way that post-trade is done generally, not just in the reporting space. How you marry those emerging capabilities with ensuring that the expertise is there to use them correctly is the challenge. And I think we play a role in that regularly, right, as a provider across the post-trade space, and certainly with our advisory or consulting business. The nice thing about that business is we can certainly augment needs, but every time we do that, we learn more, so the collective contribution is higher.
Absolutely.
So there's no easy answer to it, but to me, as I think about the clients we speak to and spend time with, it's really that measuring what you've got, what you need, and trying to marry that up against your future state.
Absolutely.
And I do think technology is, and we might get onto this, right, but technology is a key game changer at the moment, but it's only as good as the expertise and the information you have. So I think we're at an interesting point on that, and we have a big role to play.
I mean, I think from a skills and expertise perspective, obviously we help globally, including APAC, obviously. And what is interesting is after the heavy year of regulatory rewrites and refits last year, we saw a lot of smaller players needing that support that they weren't able to get from other consultancies that wanted to do larger engagements. And so our retainer model that we did, where you can just dip into half a day or a day of expertise, has been really, really important and critical to the industry, and giving that support to clients that are probably less able to support large change teams.
And that's really held true out in Asia, where it's been a very popular approach. And I think just going back to some of the earlier things we talked about, bring it into this part of the conversation, tooling like analytics tooling, for example, our TRA product, a little bit of help in implementing that into your workflow and understanding how best to use it for your unique use case goes a long way. So it's that comment I made earlier about marrying tooling and technology and capability up with your internal expertise and people. The sort of retainer model you're talking about is a key part to solving that challenge for smaller firms in particular.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so moving on to future trends. So the industry continues to evolve quickly, obviously, as we've discussed. What trends and innovations do you think will have the greatest impact on reg reporting and data analytics in the coming years?
Yeah, so there's quite a few pieces to this, and I think it'd be remiss not to talk a little about some of the potential drivers of change as well on the regulatory side, right? We've seen, particularly in Europe, that there is evolving conversation around what should derivative trade reporting look like in the future. If you look to that, as we certainly are and are contributing to, there's many indicators as to where this may go. That presents both challenge and opportunity. So the challenge obviously is that evolution and new change means back to what we've just been talking about, right? New spend, new challenges and so on. However, the convergence of this with better tooling, revolutionary post-trade platforms and technology capability means that there is genuinely an opportunity to set yourself up as a firm to ensure that your data is in a place where the tooling can use it correctly to meet the outcomes you need, mean that firms are going to be, I think, well insulated against some of this change.
Absolutely. I think it starts with data again. That if you have that database and you have that foundational layer, then you can put the appropriate technologies on top. And so one of the things that we've been speaking quite a lot recently about is CDM and DRR and how we do, how digital reporting is actually going to be used within the industry as a good use case. What are you hearing from clients about the DRR journey?
First thing I'd say is that it is very much a topic of discussion, right? And so in terms of what are we hearing about clients, I think everyone recognises the benefit in the concept of CDM as a starting point. So DRR requires CDM, right? CDM is really getting back to the point you were making earlier around that baseline, getting the data right? It's a data model at the end of the day. Having that in place, whether it be CDM or your own internal data model, is key for everyone. But then when you look at DRR, it's really fascinating because it's evolved such that it's using some of these emerging technologies. So firms are very interested in it. We're seeing people actively looking at it, looking at use cases where it can be brought in, even if it be a pilot program or the like. There is significant interest. As ever, the challenge is always finding the right use case for it, the resourcing to make it happen, and maybe there is a convergence with the fact that we do anticipate more change. So I think DRR and the likes, or these sort of programs that bring together technology, standardisation, are probably having their moment for a good reason. And that is that we are well placed with the fantastic technology coming out and the potential for change for people to be looking at this. And we're on that journey too.
I mean, I think we're ultimately looking at future-proof reporting infrastructure.
That's right.
Very good. Ollie, thank you very much for your insights today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. It's quite clear that data quality and reg compliance is progressing, and it will continue to evolve. Thought leadership like this and collaboration across the industry is going to be vital for that change.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Great.